Today on Tales of the Great Lakes, we're going to talk about Lake Superior shipwreck that has gotten much more publicity in the last couple of years due to a diver's rite of passage involved in the shipwreck. In December of 1927, 2 years before the Great Depression and in the middle of the Roaring Twenties, a Great Lakes freighter named the SS Kamloops went missing near Isle Royale, the largest natural island in Lake Superior and currently the only national park in Michigan. The Kamloops was headed to modern-day Thunder Bay, Ontario from Montreal with over 2,000 tons of cargo. A ravenous storm was coming from the northwest of Lake Superior, and the captain of the Kamloops, William Bryan, decided to head into the storm to complete the voyage, as time was money for the Great Lakes shipping industry. Then, on December 6, 1927, the entirety of the SS Kamloops staff that included 21 people seemingly vanished in thin air. Friends and loved ones of the shipworkers waited for months to hear something, anything from those on the Kamloops, but there wasn't a word. It was possible they were just lost on Isle Royale, waiting for a rescue. It wouldn't be until the next spring in 1928 that someone would find several bodies on Isle Royale that were assumed to be Kamloops shipworkers who either starved after making it off the ship or who passed during the sinking of the ship and somehow floated ashore. The next sign of the Kamloops was in December of 1928, when a trapper named Louis Coutu was working on the Agawa River in Ontario, and it was there that he picked up a literal message in a bottle from a stewardess named Alice Bettridge from the ship. I'll reveal the contents of this message later, but if you see where the Agawa River is and where Isle Royale is located on Lake Superior, this bottle would have had to traverse the entirety of the lake over that year, about 150 miles of turbulent water, before magically appearing to Louis Coutu. That would be the last sign of the Kamloops until the 1970s, as at that time there was still no sign of the ship or any clue as to how it sank, besides the fact that it was sailing through a horrendous winter storm in December. Another ship named the Quebec was just behind the Kamloops, also going to modern-day Thunder Bay, Ontario. The captain of the Quebec, a man named Roy Simpson, witnessed the Kamloops leave his eyesight into swirling blankets of ice and snow at 10:30 p.m. on December 6, 1927, but he too had no clue as to what happened to the ship. The shipwreck has gotten much more publicity as of late because a crewman of the Kamloops allegedly still guards the engine room of the package freighter, as in, his body is still on the ship in the engine room. Due to a post-mortem process called adipocere, this mariner still has his soft tissue preserved to his bones, as the bottom of Lake Superior is so cold that it acts like a natural freezer. So if you were to dive down to the ship and swim to the engine room, there would be a corpse there that still looks like it has some skin. Amongst the diving community, it's supposedly a diver's rite of passage to dive on the Kamloops and shake the hand of the crewman in the engine room. And divers have nicknamed this guy Old Whitey. What makes this even more eerie is that sometimes Old Whitey will move throughout the ship due to the tides in the lake. What was the history of the Kamloops and how did the Kamloops sink? How exactly was the ship found? Stay tuned for the chilling tale of the wreck of the SS Kamloops. The SS Kamloops was built in 1924 and christened on May 20th, 1924 by Agnes Black, the daughter of the Canada Steamship Line's superintendent, the same company that ordered the ship to be built. Kamloops was also a town in British Columbia, and the name derives from an indigenous word from the Shuswap tribe that means where the rivers meet. The Kamloops completed her sea testing on July 5th of 1924 and was owned by Steamships Limited, a subsidiary of Canada Steamship Lines of Montreal, Quebec. Canada Steamship Lines would eventually buy the ship in a very fishy business dealing, where Steamships Limited sold the Kamloops to Canada Steamships Limited for $50 million, which would be equivalent to roughly $906 million today. For a small canal ship like the Kamloops, it is completely preposterous that she would cost that much. And many of the same people that worked at Canada Steamship Lines also worked at Steamships Limited. So some speculate that this sale was a way for Canada Steamship Lines to essentially pay themselves an exorbitant sum of money while cooking the books. There was so little regulation of these companies at that time, though, that there's really no way to prove this today. The Kamloops was built by the Furnace Shipbuilding Company in Haverton, England, and stopped in Copenhagen, Denmark to load the ship up with cargo before reaching the Great Lakes with a crew of Englishmen on September 13, 1924. They would transport a cargo of pebbles to the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company of Calumet, Michigan. After she reached Calumet, the Kamloops crew was replaced by Great Lakes shipworkers, and the English mariners would sail back across the Atlantic Pond. The Kamloops was a package freighter, and her main objective was to carry package cargo such as shoes, tar paper, piping food, coiled wire for fences, and other such materials to what was then called Fort William and Port Arthur. These two villages were eventually incorporated into the town of Thunder Bay, Ontario on New Year's Day of 1970. In modern-day Thunder Bay, the Kamloops would usually be loaded up with grain from local farmers to take back to Montreal. You might ask, why would these cold towns in the northwest corner of Lake Superior be such a hub for commerce? Well, before planes were the predominant transporter of goods, Great Lakes shipping was the easiest and fastest way for central and western Canada to transport products cross-country. So Fort William and Port Arthur was a natural meeting point for anything going from Toronto or Montreal to places such as Calgary, Edmonton, or Vancouver, and vice versa. The Kamloops was 250 feet in length, 43 feet wide, and could hold up to 2,401.54 tons of goods. She had a steam engine made of Scotch boilers and could push at 9.5 knots, or 10 miles per hour. This was a rather small ship for the Great Lakes at the time, but she was this small so that she could fit into the Welland Canal between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. For some reason, most likely due to cost-saving measures, the Kamloops was not fitted with wireless radio transmission, which gave them no ability to verbally communicate with other ships. They could at least rely on their ship horns to audibly communicate with others nearby. Legally, no radios were required on ships with less than 50 people on board at this time. Captain William Bryan was the first and only captain that the Kamloops ever saw, and in her first season on the Great Lakes, she already sailed into trouble. On December 13th and 14th of 1924, there were 50 to 60 mile per hour winds on Lake Superior, with temperatures around 6 degrees. The Kamloops made it through the storm but ended up getting stuck in ice in the St. Mary's River between Nebish Island and Munisquag, Michigan. And she would have the Great Lakes Towing Company tow her and 4 other ships out of the river. These ships were the last ships to pass through the Sioux Locks and Sault Ste. Marie that year, so she was already setting a precedent for traveling late in the Great Lakes shipping season, while attempting to push through brutal winter storms. The Kamloops would get stuck in the Welland Canal once in 1925 and would get stuck in the St. Mary's River again on December 3rd of 1926. But in 1926, there weren't just 4 ships stuck in the St. Mary's River, there would end up being more than 100 ships stuck near Nebish Island. And this actually set the record for the largest ice jam in the history of the Upper Great Lakes. Some of the slush from the ice was 12 feet thick. By December 5th, the temperatures dropped to 12 below zero, which would turn all of the slush on the river into ice. Over 2,000 people were on the ice-jammed ships, and many of these freighters were running out of supplies to feed their crew. Food was eventually transported to the mariners on the ship, while coal from the bigger ships was transported to the smaller ones so that they could keep running their engines to stay warm. Harbor tugs came to break up the ice, but while this was happening, several other boats got caught up in the traffic jam. It severely disrupted the last run of the Great Lakes shipping season that year. One ship named the Coulee was largely to blame for this, as it was stuck horizontally in the river. It was estimated that Great Lakes shipping companies were losing around $50,000 a day from this ice jam, or around $903,000 a day in today's money. The harbor tugs slowly started to break more ice until all the ships were free, and the Kamloops eventually got past the ice jam on December 11th, marking 8 total days of being stuck in the St. Mary's River. So you can get a picture for how brutal it was for many of these freighters on the Upper Great Lakes, especially those that were traveling from modern-day Thunder Bay, Ontario, all the way to Toronto or Montreal. I'd imagine the crew of the Kamloops was quite weary after getting stuck for 8 days, knowing they'd still have to travel several more days to Montreal at 10 miles per hour in the middle of a Great Lakes winter. Some people might get a romantic notion of sailing the Great Lakes for a living, but it was a tough life for the crews of these ships, and it still is today. I'm sure it's nice weather in the summer, but in the spring, fall, and winter months, you're mostly bundled up on board, doing hours of repetitive work, with the fear that the weather could change at any moment, and your ship could sink, just like the hundreds of others that perished before you. It was not a life for the faint of heart. The last voyage of the SS Kamloops was also going to be the last trip of the Great Lakes shipping season for its crew. As per usual, they were headed to Port Arthur with packages such as shoes, food, tar paper, and other goods. Great Lakes shipworkers still had the memory of the ice jam the year before, and many mariners were hoping that the Great Lakes shipping companies would end the season before December this year to avoid another ice jam. The Canada Steamship Lines, the owners of the Kamloops, did not budge though, even releasing a statement saying, quote, "We will run our ships as long as the weather holds good, and as long as there's grain to carry. The experience we had last year does not deter us because we realize that a thing like that may not happen again for another 50 years, unquote. To say the least, they were wrong. And the insurance companies for these ships foresaw more shipping trouble on the lakes as they actually raised their insurance rates on November 30th of that year. 45-year-old Captain William Bryan and his crew, including 22-year-old assistant stewardess Alice Bettridge, passed through Detroit on December 1st at 11:30 a.m. The Kamloops would get up to Sault Ste. Marie and pass through the Soo Locks by December 4th. The weather was so bad at this point, though, that Captain Bryan wrote home to his wife saying he was going to anchor his ship at Whitefish Bay before heading into the storm. It is uncertain for how long Captain Bryan anchored his ship, but it is confirmed that on December 5th, the Kamloops made her way into the storm. In front of the Kamloops was the SS Quebec, captained by a man named Roy Simpson. Unbeknownst to the crews of the Kamloops and the Quebec, a second, even more violent storm front was about to thwap Lake Superior. A massive cold front was coming in from the northwest, dropping the temperature to 40 degrees below zero with at least 60-mile-an-hour winds, which forced the Kamloops to travel through what was technically classified as a bomb cyclone. The Quebec and the Kamloops were trudging through Gitchagumi on Tuesday, December 6th, still heading for modern-day Thunder Bay, Ontario. They made it across Lake Superior and all the way to Isle Royale. There had been a history of ships trying to find shelter on the island during storms, but with this being the last run of the Great Lakes season for these freighters, it seems that both Captain Bryan and Simpson wanted to complete their duties for the year and get back to their families in time for a cozy Christmas season. A man named Victor Latham, who was only 21 years old, was the wheelsman for the Kamloops and had a 5-month-old baby at home. To let the Quebec know that the Kamloops was still fighting through the bitter winds, Captain Bryan was blowing 3 long blasts with his whistle cord every minute. Above the engine room, where T.W. Verity sat, Assistant Stewardess Alice Bettridge and Head Stewardess Nettie Grafton were holding on in the ship's galley. This was Nettie Grafton's last voyage as a stewardess on a Great Lakes ship. At 45 years old, she was going to retire as a ship stewardess after the Kamloops made this trip, a retirement she would never get to enjoy. As the Quebec and the Kamloops were nearing the northern part of Isle Royale around 10 p.m. that night, they quickly became aware of the rocks and reefs surrounding the island. The Quebec, fast approaching these rocks, had quite the scare themselves. Captain Roy Simpson remembered one of the deckhands yelling, "Rocks, rocks, dead ahead, starboard, hard to starboard." The deckhands and Captain Simpson yanked the wheel to the right port side and felt the rocks under their ship. Many people in the engine room fell to the ground with this turn. Simpson then blew several short blasts to warn the SS Kamloops about the rocks that almost wrecked the Quebec. But then he watched the Kamloops sail into a dark swirling mass of snow and ice on Lake Superior. And this would be the last time that any living person saw the Kamloops above water. When the Quebec and Captain Roy Simpson finally landed at Port Arthur, they were so happy to make it to shore that they forgot to look for if the Kamloops had also made it safely. Several other ships on the lake that day had either run aground or were completely wrecked, and the Coast Guard was sent out to help them. But it wasn't until December 12th, 6 days after the Quebec last saw the Kamloops, that the Kamloops was listed as missing. 2 ships named the Ailette Prince and Murray Stewart were the first 2 ships to search for the Kamloops before the Coast Guard joined, mostly searching around Isle Royale and Manitou Island. There was another snowstorm that hit Lake Superior as soon as the search started, and this severely affected visibility on the lake. There was belief that even if the ship had sunk, that some of the crew could have survived and could be foraging on one of the islands, holding on to their dear lives. but after 4 days on December 16, 1927, the search was officially abandoned. On Christmas Eve, December 24, 1927, Canada Steamship Lines officially recognized the loss of the Kamloops and put their flags at half-mast. There was a couple more ships that would look for Kamloops survivors on Christmas Eve, but when you consider that Isle Royale is 45 miles long and 9 miles wide, with 450 smaller islands surrounding it, while there were ice chunks all around the lake, it's no wonder why no one found evidence of the freighter that winter. 5 total ships were lost and stranded that season, and the last minutes of those on board the Kamloops were sunk with the ship. On May 26, 1928, the first signs of the Kamloops emerged when a fisherman named David Lind found 2 bodies at 12 o'clock point on Isle Royale. This would have been on the northeast side of Isle Royale facing modern-day Thunder Bay, Ontario. Another boat called the Crawford went to investigate the bodies, and according to an article by the Duluth News-Tribune on May 28, 1928, the top of the wheelhouse, a spar with a flag on which was printed Kamloops, and a lifeboat were found in the area between Green Isle and Hawk Island. Captain Christensen stated that the wreckage includes all of the boat's hatches, half a lifeboat, and 5 or 6 pairs of oars. The beach is covered with medicine, candy, toothpaste, and foodstuff carried by the steamer. The reason the steamer was not found until Saturday was because ice on the little bays is just beginning to melt. Then a little over a week later, on June 4th, 6 more bodies would be found, including one of a woman who was falsely attributed to be head stewardess Nettie Grafton, but was later confirmed to be Alice Bettridge, due to Alice having natural teeth and Nettie having false teeth. And shortly after that, a 9th body was found further inland on the island and identified as first mate Henry Genest. At first, it was speculated that these 9 people had made it to shore in a lifeboat, as 8 of them were wearing a life belt, while Henry Genest was found without a life belt and may have taken it off to look for food or survival materials in the woods. Some candy from the ship was also found on the beach and was broken into, indicating that someone tried to eat this candy to stay alive. Despite this, it was suspected that all 9 of these people froze to death on the island that winter. Captain William Bryan was not among these 9 people and officially was assumed to have gone down with the ship. And then there was the mystery of the message in the bottle. In December of 1928, a Canadian Sault Ste. Marie guide, dog racer, and fur trapper, Louis Coutu, was at the mouth of the Agawa River in this part of Ontario. Louis Coutu was known by many in the region as Poker Face Louis, while his brother was hockey player Wild Beaver Billy Coutu, a former Montreal Canadiens Stanley Cup winner and captain, who was the only hockey player to ever be suspended from the NHL for life, due to the fact that he attacked 2 referees in Game 4 of the 1927 NHL Stanley Cup Finals. When this message in a bottle appeared to Louis Coutu, he opened it and the remnants revealed 2.5 pages of faded writing, most likely due to the 150-mile travel that the bottle made from Isle Royale. The note said, quote,
STR Kamloops went down with all hands near the extreme west point of Isle Royale on December 6th. All hands but myself. Finder, please notify Canal Office or Sioux Daily Star so my people will know my fate. Tell them it was just me who is not dead. Please do not disregard this note. Please, SOS, SOS, cold, cold, bitter, wondrous cold. Very urgent, please notify Sioux Star or Canada Canal. It's negative 48 degrees Fahrenheit here now. Our bare wire cargo became loaded with ice and we capsized in 18 fathoms of water. Wreck.
The note was signed Al, and Louis suspected it was written by a man at first. Now, Louis was apparently a man who enjoyed publicity and wanted money for his findings. When he came into town with the bottle and the note, he refused to give it to the local Sioux Daily Star newspaper, and also refused to show it to Canada Steamship Lines Limited, and then tried to sell the bottle and the note to the highest bidder. Many people thought that Coutu was telling a tall tale and trying to make money from a tragedy. That was until the brother of Kamloops Captain William Bryan, another Great Lakes captain by the name of Herbert James Bryan, convinced Coutu to hand over the bottle, as he suspected that the Al in the note was the assistant stewardess on the ship, Alice Bettridge. H.J. Bryan of Kingston, Ontario then figured out that the Bettridge family lived in Southampton, Ontario, and according to stories handed down in the Bettridge family, a Marine, or H.J. Bryan himself, showed up at the Bettridge household one day with the note and asked Alice's mother Emma to confirm the handwriting. After reading the note, Alice's mother Emma shouted, "It's hers!" confirming that it was indeed Alice Bettridge's writing. This note added some confusion as to how the 8 other people on shore with her passed away, as Alice said that the Kamloops went down with all hands. The lifeboat that was found at 12 o'clock point was battered to bits, so it's possible that the others drowned or died from hypothermia due to the frigid Lake Superior waters consuming the lifeboat. Then, their bodies washed up on shore while Alice made it there alive. But as I said before, Henry Jeunesse' body was found further inland. It could be that Alice never saw Henry get to shore when the lifeboat went down, and Henry may have made his way inland before finding death on Isle Royale. Alice's letter does confirm, though, that the Kamloops was loaded with ice, and this is what caused the ship to sink, meaning that the ice storm was so awful that the ice on the ship weighed the Kamloops down until it capsized to the bottom of an underwater cliff in Lake Superior, laying between 190 and 260 feet. And that is where it would lay, untouched and untraveled, until 50 years later, when Minnesota divers named Ken Engelbrecht and Randy Salter saw a phantom in the depths of Lake Superior, near 12 o'clock point. Engelbrecht was directed to the spot by a man named Roy Oberg, captain of the ship Voyager 2. Oberg used Alice Bettridge's description as a guide to find where the ship sank. At first they weren't sure that this ship was the Kamloops. Roy Oberg discovered a shipwreck laying on its side near an underwater cliff by 12 o'clock point using side scan sonar. Another boat called the Hey Boy, led by a man named Ken Merriman, traveled back to this spot, and after several dives in late August of 1977, Ken Engelbrecht finally took pictures of the shipwreck on September 5th and 6th and saw the name Kamloops on the stern laying under decades of rust and underwater debris. On the investigation of the shipwreck, they saw that the engine telegraph was still set on the finished with engines position, and this indicates that the power to the ship was cut off before the ship sunk, as experts say the crew would have put the engine telegraph on standby and not finished with engines if the ship was having trouble. The divers also discovered that the ship's starboard bow was smashed, indicating that the ship probably hit Isle Royale before it sank. There are at least 10 shipwrecks that still lay around Isle Royale, and more than 25 ships that have sunk around the island, with some resurfacing. And all these shipwrecks are probably due to the island's reefs and rocky terrain. You see, over 1 billion years ago, Isle Royale's bedrock and main ridge was actually formed by lava flows from lake volcanoes. This lava flow was called the Greenstone lava flow of the Portage Lake volcanoes. The scientists have determined this due to the minerals present on the island, such as, I'm not going to pronounce this, just, read. Also called Isle Royale Greenstone. Over the last 3 million years, the landscape of Isle Royale was further formed by glacial activity, creating ridges and reefs, and making it a dangerous place for ships to sail around. Going back to the Kamloops, it was suspected that after the ship hit a reef, forcing the freighter and her crew to be stuck there, it then took on water and ice, causing the ship to slowly sink. And so the crew had to make a decision. Do we jump into sub-zero temperatures of Lake Superior, or do we sit here and hope the ship doesn't sink anymore? Well, apparently the cabin door was found open on the shipwreck, indicating that the crew may have tried to exit the ship and this let in more water. Some probably tried to get on the lifeboat, while others tried to get on their lifebelts and swim through the icy cold water. We do know the lifeboat was eventually battered and wrecked due to how it was found on the island. There were 12 other crew members stuck in the stern house who sadly drowned with the ship, and these are the ghosts that still embody the Kamloops to this day. This was also when the first diver discovered who we now know today as Old Whitey, who might be the engineer of the ship, T.W. Verity. It's not confirmed, but it is said that he was probably in the engine room when the ship sunk. But picture this, you're diving on a newly found shipwreck for the first time, seeing 50-year-old artifacts, and suddenly you encounter several bodies with soapy skin still attached to them throughout the ship. You make your way to the engine room, and a ghostly white figure is standing there and staring at you. This ghostly white figure not only is sitting upright in the engine room, but it also moves with the tides of the lake. There's been approximately 50 more divers who have reached the depths of the Kamloops, and some say that Old Whitey doesn't just move with the tides of the lake, but even follows them around the ship. And that's when I have to give a big old nope! You may have Googled the official death toll of the SS Kamloops, and Google probably told you that the death toll of the shipwreck was 22 people, despite there being only 21 people that went down with the ship in 1927. There's a simple explanation for this. On July 13, 2013, a 55-year-old Minnesota man named Louis Coutu passed away while diving on the shipwreck. As he descended to the Kamloops, his two co-divers said he was dealing with an unknown difficulty as they reached the freighter 200 feet below water. Coutu then fell unconscious underwater. His co-divers would get him back up to the surface and onto the charter boat they dove from, before park ranger EMTs announced him dead on the scene. I can't find the exact cause of death, but that's why when you look up the death toll of the Kamloops today, it says 22 people instead of 21 people perished on the Kamloops. It's important to remember that diving on these shipwrecks is extremely dangerous, and one should proceed with great caution before deciding to do so. As for the mystery of the Kamloops, we will never know exactly how Assistant Stewardess Alice Bettridge came to be the last one alive from the crew, or what the last days of her life were like as she threw a message in a bottle into Lake Superior, hoping that it would get to her family someday. But the icy waters of fate surely delivered her message for the world to read. That'll do it for this Tales of the Great Lakes. There are many more mysteries and stories to go into from around the region, so I'm not going anywhere. I will ask my viewers one thing though. As we all know, our national parks and the water quality around the Great Lakes is currently threatened by funding cuts. So if you could find the time at all to donate to the National Park Foundation and or the Alliance for the Great Lakes, which is a nonprofit that keeps our Great Lakes clean and protected, I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Firelake Media. Thank you, and stay superior, friends.